Stop. Don't scroll past this. This is about your life, not someone else's. Something was erased from your timeline, and you were never supposed to notice. Wait. Stay with me for a second. You felt it, didn't you? That strange gap. That moment where something should have happened, but didn't. Not a delay, not a mistake, an absence. And you tried to explain it away. You told yourself maybe it just wasn't the right time. Maybe you missed an opportunity. Maybe you weren't ready. But deep down, that explanation never sat right with you. Because this wasn't about something not happening. It was about something being removed. Listen, this matters more than you think. There are moments in your life that feel heavy, intense, almost magnetic. Moments where everything aligns and you feel like something big is about to unfold. But then, nothing. It vanishes. No closure, no clear ending, just silence. And you're left standing there, questioning yourself. But here's what you didn't see. That moment wasn't unfinished. It was interrupted. Not by chance, not by your failure, by design. You've always felt different, haven't you? Like you were moving through life slightly out of sync with everyone else. Like people around you were following a script and you were improvising without instructions. That feeling wasn't confusion. It was awareness. Because your timeline doesn't follow the same rules. And that thing that disappeared from your life? That situation that suddenly collapsed, that connection that ended without reason, that path that closed when it felt like it was just beginning, it wasn't taken from you randomly, it was erased. You felt something leave your life without explanation, and it changed you in ways you can't fully describe. Comment Amen if you know something was removed to protect your path. If this is speaking to you, stay connected with Born into Light. There's more you're meant to understand, but not in the way you think. You see, most people believe loss is something that happens to them. But for you, loss has always felt different, more precise, more targeted, almost intentional, like something stepped in and said, no, not this. And you didn't understand it at the time. You thought you were being rejected, but you weren't rejected. You were redirected. And that difference changes everything. Think about it. Go back to those moments. The relationships that felt powerful but ended abruptly. The opportunities that seemed perfect but disappeared overnight. The paths you were so sure about that suddenly made no sense. You didn't just lose those things. They were removed from your timeline. Because if they had stayed, they would have taken you somewhere you were never meant to go. And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because part of you still wonders, what if? What if that person stayed? What if that opportunity worked out? What if you kept going down that path? You imagine a version of your life that feels complete, stable, maybe even easier. But here's the truth you weren't ready to see before. That version of your life wasn't real. It was a branch, a possible path, one that looked right on the surface but would have slowly disconnected you from who you really are. And something knew that. So it stepped in, not to punish you, to protect you. Stop for a moment. Feel that. Protection doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like loss. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like being left behind. But what if every time something disappeared from your life, it was actually something removing what couldn't stay? You've been carrying this quiet frustration, this feeling that things never fully come together for you, that something always interrupts right before it gets real. And you started to believe something was wrong with you, that maybe you weren't consistent enough, not lucky enough, not good enough. But that was never the truth. The truth is, your life has been edited, carefully, precisely, moment by moment. Not everything is meant to stay in your story, because your path isn't about accumulation, it's about alignment. And alignment requires removal. That's the part nobody tells you. They talk about growth, they talk about manifestation, they talk about attracting everything you want, but they don't talk about the erasing. They don't talk about how much has to be taken away for you to become who you're meant to be. You felt alone during those moments, didn't you? Like no one understood what you were going through. Because to everyone else it looked normal. Things end, people leave, opportunities come and go. But for you, it never felt random. It felt orchestrated, like something was guiding your life in a way you couldn't fully see. And that's because it is. You weren't abandoned. You were being positioned. Every removal created space. Every ending cleared a path. Every erased moment prevented something that didn't belong in your future. But here's where it gets deeper. Some of the things that were removed you were emotionally attached to. You wanted them. You believed in them. You saw a future in them. So when they disappeared, it didn't just confuse you, it hurt you. And that pain made you question everything. Your judgment, your instincts, even your worth. But the pain wasn't proof that you lost something valuable. It was proof that you were invested in something that couldn't stay. There's a difference. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to recognize the pattern. You start to realize that every time something was erased, something else quietly shifted inside you. Your awareness deepened. Your perception sharpened. Your direction adjusted. Even if you didn't notice it immediately, you weren't going in circles. You were being redirected again and again until you reached alignment. And now you're starting to see it. That strange feeling you've had recently, like something has changed, but you can't fully explain what. That's not your imagination. That's clarity beginning to form. Because now you're looking back, and instead of seeing loss, you're starting to see precision. You're starting to see that nothing left your life without a reason. And more importantly, nothing that was meant for you was ever erased. Let that settle. Because this is the part that shifts everything. What was removed from your timeline was never part of your true path. It was close, it looked real, it felt convincing. But it wasn't yours to keep. And if it had stayed, it would have delayed you, distracted you, disconnected you. You weren't losing time. You were being saved from the wrong timeline. And that's why things felt so intense. Because you were standing at the edge of paths that weren't meant for you, and something stepped in before you crossed too far. That's not failure, that's intervention. You've been guided more than you realize, even in the moments that felt chaotic, even in the moments that felt unfair, especially in the moments that made no sense at all. And now you're at a different point, a quieter point, where things feel slower but deeper, less chaotic but more intentional. That's not stagnation, that's alignment beginning. Because now, things don't need to be erased as aggressively. You're starting to choose differently. You're starting to feel what's right before it fully unfolds. You're starting to trust that inner signal you used to ignore. And that changes everything. Because now, your timeline isn't just being protected. It's being consciously walked. You're not just reacting anymore, you're recognizing. You're seeing patterns before they repeat. You're feeling misalignment before it pulls you in. And most importantly, you're no longer chasing what disappears. That's the shift. Before, you tried to hold on. Now, you understand when to let go. Before, you questioned why things left. Now, you question whether they were ever meant to stay. And that awareness is power, because it means you're no longer at the mercy of confusion. You're stepping into clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't need external validation. The kind that comes from recognizing your own path without needing anyone else to confirm it. And this is why everything that was erased had to be erased. Because it was preparing you for this moment. This level of awareness. This level of understanding. Where you no longer see your life as random events, but as a series of precise movements, guiding you exactly where you need to be. Nothing was wasted, nothing was accidental, nothing was accidental. It was all part of the alignment, and now you're not the same person who experienced those losses, you're the one who understands them. And that understanding is what was always meant to stay. Is where things begin to feel different in a way you can't fully explain yet. Because now, when something doesn't work out, you don't react the same way. There's a pause. A quiet moment where instead of chasing, you observe. And that pause, that's new. You didn't have that before. Before, everything felt urgent, like if you didn't hold on, you would lose something important. But now, something inside you is less desperate, not because you don't care, but because you're starting to see what's actually happening. Wait, notice this. You're not trying to force things anymore. That shift didn't come from nowhere. It came from everything that was erased. Every removal taught you something without explaining it. And that's why it felt confusing, because you were learning without being told what the lesson was. But here's where it gets deeper. Those erased moments, they didn't just disappear from your life. They disappeared from your identity. Think about that. You didn't just lose people. You didn't just lose opportunities. You lost versions of yourself. Versions that were tied to those timelines. Versions that would have become real if those paths had continued. But they didn't. So those versions of you never fully formed. And that's why sometimes you feel like you almost became someone else. Like you were close to a completely different life. But something stopped it. Not slowly. Suddenly. Like a cut. And you were left in between. Not who you were before, but not who you thought you were becoming. That space, that in-between feeling, that's where most people get lost. Because it feels like nothing is happening. But that's not true. That's where the real shift begins. Listen closely. You weren't left empty. You were left undefined. There's a difference. Empty feels like something is missing. Undefined means something new hasn't fully formed yet, and that's uncomfortable, because the mind wants clarity, it wants labels. It wants to know who you are and where you're going. But your path doesn't move like that. It moves through erasure first and definition later, and most people can't handle that. They rush to replace what was lost. They fill the gap too quickly. They recreate the same patterns, just in different forms. But you didn't. Even when it hurt, even when it hurts like you should, something in you resisted, and you didn't understand why. But here's the truth you're starting to feel now. You weren't meant to replace what was erased. You were meant to outgrow it. That's why nothing similar ever fully worked again. Did you notice that? Every time you tried to recreate something from your past, it felt off. Almost right, but not quite. Close, but not aligned. And eventually, it would fall apart too. Not because you failed a part two, but because you were trying to step back into a timeline that no longer exists. That door is closed. Not temporarily, completely. And that realization? It's heavy. Because it forces you to let go of something deeper than people or opportunities. It forces you to let go of who you thought you were going to be. But here's the contradiction. The more you let go of that version, the more you start to feel like yourself. Not the old version, not the imagined version. The real one. The one that doesn't need to chase. The one that doesn't need to force. The one that doesn't feel panic when something leaves. Because now, you're starting to recognize a different signal. Not excitement, not attachment, alignment. And alignment feels quieter, less dramatic, but stronger, more certain. It doesn't pull you in with intensity. It settles into you with clarity, and that's how you know something is real. Not because it overwhelms you, but because it fits. But wait, there's something you haven't fully seen yet. All those erased moments, they didn't just protect you from the wrong path. They were also clearing something else, something internal. Because every time something left, it took a layer of illusion with it. Beliefs you didn't even realize you had. Attachments you thought were part of you. Expectations you didn't question. And slowly, without you noticing, those layers started falling away, not all at once. Piece by piece. That's why the process felt long. That's why it felt repetitive. Because each erasure was removing something deeper than the surface. And now, you're closer than you've ever been to something real. But it doesn't look how you expected. It doesn't come with noise. It doesn't come with chaos. It comes with a strange kind of stillness. And that stillness? At first it feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Because you're used to intensity, you're used to things happening fast, then disappearing. But this doesn't disappear. It stays quietly, consistently, without needing your constant attention. And that's new. But here's where the final layer begins to reveal itself. Not everything was erased to remove something from your life. Some things were erased to remove you from what you were never supposed to become. Is something most people never realize in their lifetime. Because they stay in paths that slowly reshape them. They stay in environments that blur who they are. They stay long enough to forget themselves. But you didn't. Even when you tried to, even when you almost convinced yourself to settle, something disrupted it, right before it locked in, right before it became permanent. That timing? It wasn't coincidence. It was precise, almost too precise. And that's what made it frustrating, because it never happened early enough to be easy, and never late enough to be obvious. It always happened in that exact moment where you were just about to commit, just about to become that version of yourself, and then it collapsed, not gradually, instantly. Like something said, "This is the limit." And you felt it, that sharp shift, that emotional drop, that confusion that didn't match the situation, because on the surface everything looked fine, but underneath something deeper knew. This isn't you, and you couldn't explain that to anyone. How do you explain walking away from something that looked right but felt wrong in a way you couldn't prove? You can't. So you stayed quiet. You questioned yourself. You wondered if you were overthinking, if you were too sensitive, if you were the problem. But here's the unexpected truth. The more you doubted yourself, the more accurately you were being guided. It sounds backwards, but think about it. Every time your mind tried to rationalize staying, something in you became uncomfortable, restless, almost uneasy for no clear reason. That wasn't weakness. That was resistance to becoming someone you're not. And that resistance saved you, again and again, even when you didn't understand it, even when it made your life harder. Because choosing the right path for you doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like loss. Sometimes it feels like starting over. Sometimes it feels like being pulled away from something you almost had. But what you almost had was almost you. Not fully, not completely, and that difference matters more than anything. Wait, feel this. You've never actually lived a life that was misaligned long-term. You got close, closer than most people ever notice. But something always pulled you out. Before it could define you, before it could rewrite you. That's rare. Most people don't get that interruption. They adapt, they adjust, they become what their environment shapes them into. But you were interrupted over and over. And those interruptions weren't setbacks. They were boundaries, invisible ones, placed around your path. And now you're starting to see them, not as obstacles, but as protection. But here's where it shifts again. Those boundaries, they're not as active anymore. Notice that. Things aren't being forcefully removed the same way. It's quieter now, subtler, which means something has changed, and it's not your environment, it's you. You're no longer being stopped the same way, because you're starting to recognize before you step too far. That instinct you used to ignore, it's louder now, clearer, faster. You feel misalignment early, before it becomes attachment, before it becomes loss. And that's a different level of awareness, because now the erasing doesn't need to happen as intensely. You're catching it in real time. But there's still one thing left, one final layer that hasn't fully surfaced yet. You felt it. That subtle tension, that sense that something bigger was being prepared this entire time. Not just small adjustments, not just protection, preparation for something specific. And here's the part you've been circling around without fully seeing. Those erased timelines, they weren't random paths you lost. They were incompatible futures. Every single one of them. Futures where you would have survived, but not awakened. Futures where you would have functioned but not understood. Futures where you would have fit in but slowly disconnected from something deeper inside you. And that deeper part, that's what was being protected the entire time. Not your comfort, not your plans, your essence, who you are, before the world tells you who to be. And that can't be compromised, not on your path. That's why things had to be removed so precisely, because even small misalignments would have compounded over time, and eventually you wouldn't recognize yourself. But that never happened, because you were pulled back again and again. And now here you are, not where you expected, not who you planned to be, but closer to something real than you've ever been. And there's a reason for that. A reason that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. But it's getting closer. You can feel it, that shift, that quiet sense that something is about to become clear. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to finally understand why your timeline had to be erased before it could be rewritten. Isn't about loss. It's about access. Access to something you couldn't reach as the version of you that existed before. Let that sit for a second, because this is where everything starts to tighten. You've been thinking those moments were taken away from you, but what if they were locking something away from you? Not forever. Just until you became someone who could actually handle it. That's the part that changes the meaning. Because now, it's not about what left, it's about what hasn't been given yet. And suddenly, those gaps in your life don't feel empty anymore. They feel reserved, like space that hasn't been filled on purpose. But wait. If something was being held back, then that means something is coming forward, something that required all those removals to make sense, something that couldn't exist alongside those other paths. And this is where the pattern reveals itself more clearly. Every time something disappeared, it wasn't replaced immediately. There was always a delay, a space, a silence, and you thought that silence meant nothing was happening. But that silence was where the shift was being built. Internally, quietly, without needing your awareness. That's why it felt like time was being wasted, but it wasn't. It was being used differently, not for external progress, for internal alignment. And that kind of progress doesn't show itself right away. It accumulates, it prepares, it reshapes how you see before it changes what you experience. And now, you're starting to notice something subtle. Your reactions are different. Situations that would have pulled you in before don't have the same hold on you now. That's not coincidence. That's calibration. But here's the contradiction you didn't expect. The more aligned you become, the less you feel like chasing anything at all. Not because you've lost desire, but because you've gained clarity. And clarity removes urgency, which feels strange at first. Because you were used to movement, to momentum, to trying. But now, you're more still, more observant, more selective. And from the outside, that can look like nothing is happening. But inside, everything is reorganizing. And here's where it gets even more precise. Those erased timelines, they weren't just preventing outcomes, they were preventing attachments. Attachments that would have made it impossible for you to receive what's actually meant for you, because you would have held on, you would have invested, you would have committed, and once you commit to something misaligned, it becomes harder to leave, even when you feel it, even when you know. That's why it had to be removed early, not because it wasn't good, but because it wasn't final, and you were never meant to settle for something that was almost right. You are being positioned for something exact, something that doesn't require guessing, something that doesn't leave you questioning. But you couldn't see that before, because you were still comparing, still wondering what you lost, still imagining what could have been. But now, that pull is fading, slowly, naturally, without force. And that's how you know it's real. Because real shifts don't demand attention. They change you quietly, until one day you realize you're no longer the same person who needed those things. And that realization, it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's calm. certain, almost obvious, like something you always knew but couldn't articulate. But listen, there's still one final piece that hasn't fully landed yet. You felt it approaching. That sense that everything you've been through is pointing to something specific. Not vague, not abstract, something intentional. Because all this preparation, all this removal, all this redirection, it wasn't just to protect you, it was to position you. For a moment, a shift, an alignment point that changes everything after it. And here's the unexpected part. It doesn't arrive the way you think it will. No announcement, no clear signal, no dramatic beginning. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticeable at first, and if you're not aware, you could miss it. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't match your expectations. And that's why everything had to be erased before. Because if those old expectations were still active, you wouldn't recognize what's actually meant for you. You would overlook it, dismiss it, or worse, replace it with something familiar and fall back into the same loop. But you're not in that loop anymore. That's already been broken. That's why things feel different now. Less reactive, more intentional, more clear. And now you're closer than you've ever been to that moment. That point where everything clicks, not in a loud way, in a way that settles deeply. And when it does, you won't feel like something new is starting. You'll feel like something true has finally been allowed to begin. And at first you might not even trust it, because it won't feel like the intensity you're used to. No rush, no pressure, no overwhelming pull, just a quiet certainty. And that's unfamiliar, so your mind will question it. Is this really it? Why does it feel so calm? But that calm, that's the signal. Not excitement, not chaos. Clarity, and clarity doesn't shout, it settles. Wait, notice this shift. For the first time, you're not trying to figure everything out. You're not chasing answers. You're not forcing direction. You're allowing, and that's something you weren't able to do before. Because before, you were still holding on to pieces of timelines that no longer existed. Even if you didn't realize it, even if you told yourself you had moved on. There were still fragments, subtle ones, in the way you thought, in the way you expected things to happen. In the way you expected things to happen. In the way you defined progress. But those fragments, they've been dissolving, quietly, without resistance. And now, you're lighter. Not because life is easier, but because you're no longer carrying what doesn't belong to you. And here's where it deepens. That thing you feel approaching, it's not something being added to your life. It's something finally able to reach you. There's a difference. Because it's always existed, just not within your reach. Not while you were connected to those other paths. Not while your attention was divided. Not while your identity was still forming around things that were never meant to stay. So it waited, not passively, precisely, until the conditions were right. Until you were right. And that's the part that most people never understand. Timing isn't about the outside world. It's about internal readiness. And your readiness was built through everything that was removed. Every interruption, every collapse, every moment that forced you to step back instead of forward. Those weren't delays, they were alignments. Adjustments you couldn't have made consciously. But now, you're aligned enough to receive without distortion, without forcing it into something it's not, without trying to control it. But here's the contradiction. The closer you get to it, the less you feel the need to chase it at all, because something in you already recognizes it, before it fully arrives. That recognition, it's subtle, but undeniable, like remembering something you've never experienced before. And that's where things begin to shift again. Not outside, inside. Your perception changes, what you value changes, what you respond to changes. Things that once felt important feel distant now, almost irrelevant, not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. And you're no longer in a temporary state. You're stepping into something stable, something that doesn't require constant adjustment. And that stability, it's something you've never truly experienced before, not like this. Because before, everything had an expiration, everything had a hidden limit, everything eventually revealed itself as incomplete. But this doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, and that's what makes it unfamiliar, because you're used to things disappearing, you're used to things being erased. But what happens when something doesn't leave? What happens when something stays? That question you haven't fully answered yet, but you're about to, because this next phase, it's not about removal, it's about confirmation. And confirmation doesn't come through words. It comes through consistency, through presence, through something showing up and not disappearing. And when that happens, you won't need to question it. You won't need to analyze it. You won't need to chase it. You'll just know. But here's the part that completes everything you've been feeling. The reason your timeline was erased was never just about protecting you from the wrong things. It was about making sure that when the right thing finally reaches you, there's nothing left in you that could reject it. And that's the part that quietly changes everything. Because before, even when something right came close, you weren't fully open to it. Not intentionally, but subtly. Through doubt, through overthinking, through trying to make it fit into old patterns. And without realizing it, you would distort it. You would question it until it no longer felt right. You would hesitate until the moment passed. But that version of you isn't here anymore. You've been refined, not by gaining more, but by losing what couldn't stay. And now, there's space, clear space, not crowded with expectations, not filled with noise, not influenced by what almost was. Just you, present, aware, ready in a way you couldn't have been before. And this is why nothing made sense back then, because you were trying to understand a process that was still unfolding. You were inside it. Now, you're seeing it from the outside. And it's different, it's quieter, but it's complete. Every erased moment, every sudden ending, every path that dissolved right when it felt real, it all leads here, to this version of you. The one who no longer needs to chase clarity, because you've become it. And here's the final shift. Nothing was taken from you, not in the way you thought. It was filtered, refined, aligned, until only what truly belongs can reach you. And now, you're no longer waiting for things to make sense. You are the moment where they finally do. This is why it happened. This is why it had to happen. Not to leave you empty, but to leave you exact. And from this point forward, nothing that is meant for you will feel uncertain again. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you become clear enough to recognize what was always yours and let everything else pass without confusion. Nothing was taken from you, it was all aligning you. If you're ready to walk your true path, subscribe and stay with this journey. Because you were never lost, you were being led.